Good evening. My name is Noah Levine. I'm with the Jewish Community Legacy Project. JCLP works exclusively with small congregations in central Pennsylvania and throughout the United States, helping them plan, whether it be for current issues or for long-term needs. Both JCLP and the Jewish Community Foundation of Central Pennsylvania are proud to sponsor this four-part series, Jewish Ethics, of which tonight's program is the introductory session. I would like to recognize the Foundation's Paulette Kiefer, Executive Director, and Rebecca Robinson, Director of Community Relations. And especially, we thank the Central Pennsylvania Small Congregations Committee, comprised of leadership from 15 small congregations in the region, for planning the series. The committee has been meeting for 2 years to address common issues and to bring programs to small congregations with the purpose of enhancing Jewish life and experiences in this region. Many of you hopefully have attended the Tu B'Av, Tu B'Shvat, and Shavuot programs, and the committee is in the process of planning a Shabbaton for later in 2022. The Jewish Ethics series is designed to be informative, relevant, and interesting. Tonight's program will be followed by 3 equally important programs: Jewish Ethics and the Environment, Jewish Ethics and War, Jewish Biomedical Ethical Issues. Each of these programs will feature a renowned speaker and will include also a 2-person panel of local experts and a moderator, all from Central Pennsylvania synagogues. We will send you information about these programs. Tonight's program is in 2 parts. Our speaker, Dr. Paul Wolpe, will share with us his views on Jewish ethical decision-making. After his presentation, you will be able to ask questions. For the sake of convenience and time, all questions will be submitted in the chat room. All you need to do is go to the bottom of your screen, click on the icon that says chat. You will type your question in the chat box, hit return, and your question will be posted. You can send in questions at any time during this program. Rebecca or I will read the questions to Dr. Wolpe. We will try to get to as many questions as we can before we adjourn, which will be a little after 8 o'clock. After the meeting, we will email you a very brief survey about your reaction to tonight's program. Please make sure that you are muted throughout the program. Now, I am honored to introduce our speaker, Dr. Paul Root Wolpe, who is the Raymond F. Shinazi Distinguished Research Chair in Jewish Bioethics, Professor of Medicine, Pediatrics, Psychiatry, Neuroscience, and Psychology, and the Director of the Center for Ethics at Emory University. He is the Editor-in-Chief of Neuroscience and sits on the editorial boards of over a dozen professional journals. Dr. Wolpe served for 17 years as Senior Bioethicist for NASA and has served as President and Fellow at a number of bioethic institutes. Dr. Wolpe publishes widely in sociology, medicine, and ethics, and has contributed to a variety of encyclopedias on ethical and bioethical issues. Trained as a social scientist, a rare background for an ethicist, Dr. Wolpe's work focuses on the social, religious, ethical, and ideological impact of medicine and technology on the human condition. He has also been a leader in the national bioethical conversation on COVID-19 and vaccine distribution. Dr. Wolpe speaks internationally on topics in the field of Jewish thought. He also works in interfaith ethics. A popular speaker internationally, Dr. Wolpe has been chosen by the website Faculty Row as a super professor and by the teaching company as a superstar teacher of America. He has won many awards and is a frequent contributor and commentator in both the broadcast and print media. I have known Paul for many years, and he has spoken at my synagogue in Marietta, Georgia. Most importantly, however, Paul is a native of Harrisburg and is happy to reconnect virtually with you all. Thank you, Paul, for being here this evening.
Well, thanks so much, Noah. It's such a pleasure. As you say, I'm a central Pennsylvanian. I wasn't born there, but I spent my formative years there in Harrisburg and have been back there a number of times and have enormous affection for the area. So I'm delighted to have been asked to participate in this program. So Noah and I discussed possible things I could talk about and settled on a question. And that question is, when we try to make ethical decisions, how do we make them? How do we think about the contribution of rational thought and emotions to ethical decision making? So I am going to show some slides. So I'm sharing my screen now. You should be able to see my slides now. Noah, shake your head. Rebecca, great. Okay. So the question we're going to ask is this: looking both at secular philosophy and at Jewish thought, how do we think about, balance, or favor one over the other rational, philosophical, ethical decisions, reasoning our way to what the right ethical decision is, and intuitive or emotional ethical decision making? Do we follow our gut? Do we follow our heart? How is it that we make the kinds of decisions we need to make? And this has been a debate that has gone on for centuries, if not millennia, and has been part of the Jewish conversation as well as the secular conversation around ethics. So Aristotle, who we'll talk about a little bit more, once wrote, "We ought to have been brought up in a particular way from our very youth," as his teacher Plato says, "so as to both delight in and to be pained by the things that we ought." In other words, when one acts ethically or tries to make an ethical decision, it is sometimes very difficult. I can tell you that from 40 years of being an ethicist. Ethics is not for sissies. Sometimes you have to sacrifice a lot to make the right ethical decisions. Sometimes you have to lose friends. Sometimes you have to lose money. Sometimes you have to stand up against a large crowd who are doing the wrong thing. But there is a certain deep contentment and satisfaction in living an ethical life. And so Aristotle tried to capture both sides of that equation. Philosophers have talked about the question of the head versus the heart for a very long time. So Aristotle, who is really in some ways the spiritual father of Western philosophy and of Western ethics, he said that emotions are closely connected with judgment, belief, decision-making. And what we need to do, said Aristotle, is use our emotions in ethical decision-making, but not just in a raw way, not just what we feel. We have to cultivate good character. We have to cultivate moral virtue. For that reason, Aristotle and his whole school following are called virtue ethicists. The idea is this: if you cultivate the moral life, if you educate yourself, if you train yourself to be a moral being, then your emotions will lead you to make the right kinds of ethical decisions. So you need to have a balanced, sober, emotional life when you think about ethics, and you need to combine that with critical thinking, and then you will make the right ethical decision. Kant, on the other hand, who is really the most influential modern philosopher around ethics, maybe the most influential modern philosopher in Western philosophy, said something very opposite that. Amongst the ancient Greeks, it was the Stoics who really articulated this perspective. So Kant is in the long line of the Stoics. And what the Stoics and what Kant says is emotions are inappropriate in any way in making ethical decisions. Ethical decisions have to be made in a rational way. it doesn't matter how you feel about it. It doesn't matter whether you want to. It doesn't matter whether your heart or your gut tells you to do something. The way in which you make a decision is you think about it in a rational way and you work your way. And Kant had his own philosophy about how to do this through what he called the categorical imperative. And I don't want to get into the philosophy too much. The point is that if you make even the right ethical decision through intuition, through emotion, through gut feelings, it has no moral worth, said Kant. Because you could have just as easily come to the wrong ethical decision. You were lucky. The way to get to the right ethical decision is to use the tools of Western philosophy to understand the nature of the ethical problem, to apply from Kant's views a certain set of principles to working out the ethical decision, and then following what he called your duty under moral law, which he thought of as a rational system of coming to that conclusion. So in some sense, these are the two sides of the equation. Aristotle, who thought there was a very strong role for emotion. Nobody, by the way, who's taken it seriously at all, says only emotions should be used to make ethical decisions. Everybody brings rational thought into it too. The question, you don't just, make emotional decisions all the time. Imagine how disruptive that would be. But the question is, do emotions have a role in this? And I'm going to throw in a third philosopher just because he's a member of the tribe, and that's Spinoza, one of the great Jewish philosophers, though he was put under cherem, excommunicated from the Jewish community for his heretical views. And he was a follower of the sort of Stoic Kantian way of thinking about this. And he believed philosophy frees us from the bondage of our emotions. People who are trapped under the sort of varying waves of emotion are not reliable thinkers. Emotions frustrate us. They can easily they're mercurial, they change. Love leads to hate very easily. And in fact, there is a place for what we think of as emotions, but it's not under our emotional life. A really disciplined mind and a disciplined heart can lead us to what he thinks of as joy. Joy is not an emotion of a sense of happiness that comes from the emotional part of our being. Rather, if we really study philosophy and we understand contemplation and we see the systematic logic and order of the universe, that which he called God, we will feel a sense of deep joy that comes from rational contemplation. So as we see, and I could give you many, many other philosophers that come down on both sides. Hume, for example, was very much on the emotional side of this argument. So this argument goes back and forth throughout the history of Western philosophy. I want us to step back and I want to show you something that I think is very interesting about the nature of ethics itself, stepping outside of philosophy and into biology and evolutionary thought. At the lower right of the screen is a wonderful man named Frans de Waal, who is probably the world's greatest living primatologist. He studies chimpanzees and bonobos. And if you want to watch a really great TED Talk, for those of you who watch TED Talks, find Frans de Waal's talk on animal morality. Frans spent the last part of his career, he just retired a couple of years ago, studying how animals make moral decisions. And he puts moral dilemmas in front of monkeys, in front of elephants, in front of animals, and he shows that animals have the capacity to make moral decisions. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. If you're a social animal, if you live in a group, imagine a group of monkeys, and there's a finite number of bananas that have to be shared among the monkeys, you either are going to fight each other for them, or you're going to evolve a sense of fairness. How do we fairly distribute scarce resources? And every social animal, or most social animals, find a way to do that. And to Frans de Waal, that is the sort of evolutionary beginning of a sense of ethics, fairness, equal distribution. He has some wonderful, wonderful clips of animals showing fairness. The most famous one is two capuchin monkeys for whom grapes are the most delicious thing that they possibly can imagine, while cucumbers are just okay. So they have two monkeys next to each other. They have one perform a task. He gets a cucumber. The other performs a task. He gets a cucumber. They're both happy. They do another task. One gets a grape. The other gets a grape. They're both happy. They do another task and they give the first one a grape. Then the second one does the same task, but he gets a cucumber. And he goes crazy. He takes the cucumber, he throws it in the face of the technician. He starts banging and kicking his cage. It's not fair. I did the same thing that other monkey did, and he got a grape. And you're giving me a lousy cucumber? I should get a grape too. And what Frans de Waal is trying to show is that there's an innate sense of fairness that's been violated. And if even a monkey has that sense of fairness, we can imagine that that sense of fairness and treating people equitably, which we kind of think of as a human trait, has precursors in our primate ancestry. Then, to look at it a little differently, Paul Bloom, who's at Yale, has studied morality in infants. And the way he does it is he takes really young children, 6 months, 12 months, he puts them in front of a screen where there's an animation of people acting, stick figures playing and doing things. And he has cameras above the screen that track the eye movement of the infant. What is the infant looking at all times? And I won't, and again, this is a very complicated study and there's a lot of controls, but the bottom line is so he shows like a video of one stick figure stealing a toy from another stick figure or knocking them down. And the children respond to that. And through how much time they spend looking at each figure, depending on what the figure is doing, the bottom line is, as the name of his book says, that the origins of good and evil, or fairness and unfairness, are the rudimentary parts of it are there practically when we are born. Then we refine it over time by teaching what good and bad is and how we should think about it. But the sort of neurological basis of goodness and badness and fairness and unfairness is there almost from birth. And these are important things to remember. It's important to remember that we're born with it's kind of, I like to analogize it to eating, right? We all are born hungry. We all are born as eaters, but what we learn we can eat and can't eat are very different in different societies. In some societies, amongst Jewish societies and Muslim societies, we don't eat pigs. But in Southeast Asia, they eat dogs, right? If you or I ate a dog, we would probably get physically ill. Think about that. There's nothing that makes us physically ill about eating dogs. Other human beings do it. It's a mental construct that we have about what it is that we should and should not eat that will actually lead our body to rebel when we eat something we shouldn't. Well, it's the same thing with ethics. We're taught different systems of ethics in different times and different places, which is a whole other talk that I could give some other time. But we're born with the raw materials and they are refined through socialization. So how do we actually make ethical decisions? How many of you, just show me, for those who I can see, raise your hand, have heard of the trolley problem? Just raise your hand quickly. Okay, so a few of you have and a few of you haven't. So I'm gonna go through it very, very quickly. The trolley problem is a classic philosophical problem, and it has been used a lot to talk about ethics. And here's how the trolley problem goes. Here's 2 books about it. There are now literally hundreds of books about it. The trolley problem, or would you throw the fat guy off the bridge? The other one's called, will you kill the fat man? You'll see in a minute, for those of you who haven't heard of it, why a fat man is involved. So here is the first part of the trolley problem. It's a 2-part problem. Problem number 1, a trolley is going down the tracks and it is going to run over and kill 5 people who are tied to the tracks. Don't worry about how absurd the situation is. It's a philosophical problem. It's not supposed to be realistic. It's supposed to be metaphorical so that we can try to solve a problem. You walk up on this and you see what's about to happen. You're the guy there in the blue shirt standing up, trying to cover his eyes, but peeking. And you realize that you're in front of a switch. If you pull that switch, the trolley car will switch to the left-hand track and will run over one person who's tied there. You will be the direct cause of that person's death. If you do nothing, he doesn't die, but you will have saved 5 people. Do you pull the switch? Now you think about that for a second. I'm not going to ask people to vote, but just think about it. How would you vote if you were asked that question? Remember, both philosophically and, by the way, in Jewish thought as well, doing nothing is a decision. Your decision not to pull that switch is also a decision that causes 5 people to die. So you don't have a moral out here. You either have to do nothing and 5 people will die, or pull the switch and 1 person will die. Now, when you ask people this all over the world, you get about 80 to 85%. It can be down in the 70s in some cultures, even higher in other cultures, but somewhere around there say they would pull the switch. And when you ask them why, the answer is the same everywhere. Because I'm saving 5 lives and sacrificing 1. If I do nothing, 5 people die and 1 is saved. So the moral calculus here is save the greatest number of lives you can. And about 85%, let's say, of people say that's what they would do. Scenario number 2. Same situation, trolley's going down a track, 5 people are tied to the track and they'll all die if you do nothing. Except this time, that's you up on this little trellis, this bridge over the track. And standing there, happily dancing apparently, is a very fat man. Why a very fat man? Because we need to make it so that you're not big enough to jump off the bridge yourself. But if you push the fat man off the bridge, he will fall in front of the trolley will hit him, he's bulky enough that he will stop the trolley, and you will save the 5 people on track. Doesn't matter how unrealistic this is, it isn't about realism. The question is, do you push the fat man off the bridge? And when you ask those 85% of the people who say they would pull the switch, whether they would push the fat man off the bridge, about 85% of them say no. But that makes no sense. In both cases, you're sacrificing 1 life to save 5. And in one case, the vast majority of the people would do it. And in the other case, the vast majority of the people wouldn't do it, which leads us to think that it isn't all about rational calculation. So what is actually going on here? What's going on here, and this has been debated and debated till there are hundreds of books. There's even people call this whole debate about it trolleyology. Some people major in trolleyology. There are hundreds of different sub scenarios. People switch things around. One person put people on a rotating platform. Other people look at race by giving racial identities or political identities to the different people. You wouldn't believe all the variations, but they are all about this fundamental question. And what it boils down to is a rational versus an emotional kind of decision, or a personal versus an impersonal decision. It feels different pulling a switch than pushing someone off a bridge. And people won't do one and will do the other, even though the rational calculus is similar. And so why is this important? Because what happened was Joshua Green, who is now at Harvard, when he was a graduate student at Princeton, he and his mentor, Jonathan Cohen, 2 nice Jewish lads, did an experiment that's now very, very famous. What they did, and philosophers have been arguing about the trolley problem for a long time. What they did was they stuck people in a brain imaging machine, in an fMRI, and they asked them the trolley problem and saw what their brains did as they tried to figure this out. And what they discovered, perhaps unsurprisingly, but they proved it for the first time, was that when people were thinking about pulling the switch, the part of their brain that was activated, that was thinking about it, was the prefrontal cortex, the front part of the brain. And that's where we do our logical and rational thinking. When people ask the question about pushing the fat man off the bridge, the limbic system lit up. That's the emotional center of the brain, which led them to say we make emotional ethical decisions and we make rational ethical decisions, but we ourselves don't recognize that sometimes our ethical decision making is rational and sometimes it's emotional. We go fluidly between the two, because when you asked people why they would pull the switch but not push the fat man off the bridge, they often had a very hard time explaining why, other than saying things like, you don't push people off of bridges. Well, you don't pull a switch and kill people either, right? But there was something different about these two scenarios. People had a very hard time articulating what it was. And now through this fMRI study, there are theories about personal versus impersonal decision-making, emotional versus rational decision-making, and it really opened up this whole way of thinking. And I want to give you an example from my field, bioethics. So this was a study that was done where they asked people a lot of questions about genetics and especially about protecting embryos in genetic research. And there's a lot I could show you about this, but I'm just going to show you one answer. So here was a question. You were supposed to agree or disagree, strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree. And what I have here is the number of people who agreed, strongly agreed and agreed. And that was 53.2% of the people asked strongly agreed or agreed that it would be terrible if embryos were destroyed because of policies that promote embryonic stem cell research. Great, okay? 53% people seem to think you should not destroy embryos to do medical research. But then later on in the survey, after people forgot this question, they asked exactly the opposite question. It would be terrible if cures were delayed because of policies that make embryonic stem cell research difficult. That's exactly the opposite. And guess what? 67.3% agreed with this. Now, if you add that up, that's 120%. In other words, 20% of the people, 1 out of 5 people agreed with both of these statements, and they're directly opposite each other. And this is an example of how, sometimes we think with the head, well, that'd be bad if cures were delayed, and sometimes we think with the heart, we don't want embryos destroyed. And some people will contradict themselves when faced with a logical or rational versus an emotional decision. So now I'm going to give you a quick little wonderful vignette. Joshua Nobe is a psychologist. I want you all to think about this. Again, we won't be able to vote, but I'm going to just ask you to think about it. So, quick scenario. A man went to the president of his company and said, we're thinking of starting a new program. We will make money, but the program will also harm the environment. The president answered, I don't care at all about harming the environment. I just want to make as much money as I can. Let's start the new program. They started the new program, and sure enough, the environment was harmed. And the question is, would you say the chairman intentionally harmed the environment? Should he be sanctioned or condemned? And the majority of people say yes. He knew this was going to harm the environment. He said he didn't care about harming the environment. So he should. Normally, I'd ask you to vote and we talk about it, but we don't have time and it's hard on Zoom anyway. But okay, so you all get this at least, whether you agree or not, that people could see this as intentionally harming the environment. Now I'm going to give you another scenario, exactly the same scenario, only one word is changed. A man went to the president of the company and said, we're thinking of starting a new program. We will make more money, but the program will also help, not harm, help the environment. The president answers, I don't care at all about helping the environment. I just want to make as much money as I can. Let's start the new program. They started the new program. Sure enough, the environment was helped. Would you say the chairman intentionally helped the environment? Should he be rewarded and praised? And most people say no. But that doesn't make any sense. Why do you blame him when he does exactly the same thing, but it harms the environment, but you don't give him any credit when he does exactly the same thing and it helps the environment? Another example, we think of help and harm differently. We respond to harm more emotionally. It's more destructive. We have problems with harm, while we think about help rationally. He didn't help the environment. He didn't mean to do it, so we don't want to give him credit. So these are just some quick examples of how we split the way we think about ethics into rational ways of thinking versus emotional ways of thinking. And we don't even know that we do it. We don't even know why we do it. And when you give people, for example, this scenario, the Nobe scenario, and you ask them, why did you decide differently when we only changed one word? again, people have a very hard time understanding their own response, understanding why they thought of harm one way and thought of helping another way. So let's take Kant's view, right? I mean, let's take the idea that maybe the mistake is ever thinking emotionally about ethical decision making. What if we always made our decisions rationally? Is that a good thing? It's what one whole strain of Western philosophy suggests. And I want to give you one example of how that's not good. We could talk about this also for the rest of the time, but let me give you an example. Some of you may have heard of Peter Singer. He's one of the most famous philosophers alive today. He's famous for a number of things, perhaps most famously when he's now at Princeton, but he spent a lot of his career in Australia, where he wrote a book called Animal Liberation. And he is considered the father of the animal rights movement, the father of vegetarianism and veganism in the modern day, the father of animal rights, like giving apes rights like they have in the UK and other places. So he became very famous. But then he wrote another book and started speaking a lot about his view of consequentialism, very rational and very popular and common way of thinking about ethics that goes something like this. When you have to make an ethical decision, you think about what the consequences will be. If the consequences improve the common good, you do it. If they cause more harm than good, you don't do it. This is called utilitarianism or consequentialism. You probably learned about it if you ever took Philosophy 101 in college. One of the three sort of great ways of thinking about ethics. One of the problems with consequentialism is if you really take it seriously, and you take it to its logical conclusion, as Peter Singer does because he's a good philosopher, you end up saying things that are really problematic. So, for example, Peter Singer has said that if there is a child who is born disabled, we should kill that child. He doesn't advocate this. He says his philosophy leads him to conclude, but he doesn't think society would tolerate it. You should kill that child and have another child with a greater chance for happiness. It will improve the child's happiness. You'll end up with a happy child instead of a severely disabled child. It'll improve your happiness. You'll end up with a healthy child instead of an infirm child. And so from a consequentialist point of view, says he, one should actually try to have the healthiest child possible. Now, as you can imagine, this went over like a lead balloon, and the disabled community, especially disabled rights community, hate Peter Singer. Anytime he appears anyway, groups like Not Dead Yet, which are a group of severely disabled people, it's called Not Dead Yet because they're often asked questions like, how could you possibly want to live like that? Wouldn't you rather die? And no, they wouldn't rather die. They very much enjoy their lives given their disabilities. They protest against him. So here, down here, can you see that arrow moving when I move the arrow? Yeah, okay. Denounce lethal anti-disability healthcare policy advocated by Peter Singer. There they are protesting him. Here's a sign at one of their anti-Peter Singer, Peter Singer enemy number one of disability rights with an academic stamp of approval because he's at Princeton. But that's what happens when you take consequentialism, a rational philosophy, to its extreme, even to the point that William Salatin, following Peter Singer's philosophy, argues why we shouldn't restrict abortion to when the fetus is in the womb, but we should extend the right to abort to a certain period after the child is born. Because that way, just like we can abort a severely disabled child in utero, we should allow that child to die for a certain small period of time after it's born as well, after birth abortion. Now, I'm not here to argue the morality of any of this. I only bring this up to point out that if you take rationality to its logical extreme, to its logical conclusion, you end up having to argue this in some way. Right? I mean, this is the problem with sort of rationality gone amok. You end up with what I think of, and I hope most of you think of, as severely unethical arguments because you're following your rationality into irrational areas. That's what kind of slavish fealty to rationality leads us to. Same thing, of course, though, is true of emotional decision-making and morality without any rationality. Here's an example by Leon Kass, who was the head of President Bush's Bioethics Commission. Some of you have probably read some of Leon Kass's work. He wrote a pretty well-known commentary on the Bible. He's a Jewish thinker. And when cloning first started, he wrote an article called "They Are Human, They Cannot Be Replicated, the Moral Repugnance of Cloning." And I show you that because what he said in that article and in some of his other articles is when we feel a sense of repugnance, we have to know that there's something morally wrong there and we should listen to our sense of repugnance. What's the problem with that? Well, if we look back in history, homosexuality was thought of as repugnant. Interracial marriage was thought of as repugnant. By the way, interreligious marriage was thought of as repugnant. Repugnance is very much dependent on the social mores of the day. And if you depend on repugnance as your thermometer of moral worth, you're going to make some really, really bad decisions as well. And I'll give you one other example that shows it more subtly than that. That's a pretty sort of gross example. There's something in ethics or in bioethics called the rule of rescue. The rule of rescue goes like this. This is little Jessica. Some of you who are on the older side will remember she fell down a well in Texas. There was a hole about 3 feet diameter. She fell down and she was sitting, I forget how many feet down, 20 or 30 feet down at the bottom of this well, and they couldn't get her out. Why is this about the rule of rescue? They spent millions of dollars drilling through solid rock to create a tunnel down diagonally to where she was to finally pull Jessica out. Now, not one person argued millions of dollars. For millions of dollars, we could save 500,000 starving kids in Africa, let Jessica die, and let's spend the money on something better. Never heard that argument once. But if you follow a utilitarian point of view, that makes sense. Why do I show you this under emotions? Because the rule of rescue is an emotional rule. What do I mean by that? If you poll people and you say, we have a finite amount of money. We have a finite amount of money to spend in health insurance. So should we use our health insurance to fund experimental treatments that have not been proven to work? The vast majority of people say no. We understand that. If we don't know if a treatment works, we shouldn't pay for it. But then what happens is little Johnny has some dread disease and his mom brings him onto the news and says all of the standard treatments have failed, but there's this experimental treatment that might help little Johnny, even though it's not proven, but the insurance company won't pay for it. And all of those people who said insurance companies shouldn't have to pay for experimental treatment write hateful letters to the insurance company saying, how come you're not giving this experimental treatment to little Johnny? The rule of rescue is we believe things in principle that when we see them expressed in an individual, because of the emotional connection and the emotional valence of seeing an individual suffering, we throw out the rational decision we made earlier and we decide that we should pay for this experimental treatment. So what we bring from this is that pure rational decision-making doesn't seem to work. Pure emotional decision-making doesn't seem to work. So what's our takeaway from this? Well, here's the problem with this, and it's a subtle philosophical problem that I hope everyone gets when I'm done explaining it, because I think the problem is a categorical error. Here it is. There's our brain. There's the brain of everybody here. We have two major ways our brain work. One is cognition and one is emotion. Those are the two major systems of our brain. Under cognition are a lot of cognitive things that we do. We have rationality, we have calculation, we have belief, we have memory. These are all part of our cognitive, we have perception, these are all part of our cognitive world. Under emotion, we have a whole series of things we love, we hate, we have anger, we have compassion, we have envy. So rationality is a form of cognition. Now, we can compare cognition and emotion. We can compare those two things and talk about the difference. But notice in all of these cases, they're not comparing cognition to emotion. They are comparing rationality to emotion. So they are taking a subcategory of cognition and comparing it to the broader category of emotion. That is a category error. You can't compare rationality to emotion. You can compare rationality to love, anger, compassion, but you can't compare it to emotion. That's a category error. So what we need to do is say something like, when we're thinking about an ethical issue, should we use rationality or compassion? That's a correct question because it's comparing two things at the same level of category. And in fact, that's a really interesting question. When we have the rule of rescue, rationality says, don't use insurance for experimental treatment. Compassion, not emotion, compassion says, try to help little Johnny. And that's where the conflict happens. So this is the Dalai Lama. The picture on the right is my wife and myself meeting with the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala, India at his headquarters. And also in that room, though you can't see him in this particular picture, is my brother, Rabbi David Wolpe. And I only mention that to tell you a quick little funny anecdote, as long as we're in the Dalai Lama's headquarters. The Dalai Lama asked David, as a rabbi, so explain to me what it means that the Jews are the chosen people. The Dalai Lama is he's got a great sense of humor and he's very mischievous. So he asked that question with this sly smile on his face. He wanted to see what David would say about being the chosen people. So David gave him a very good rabbinical answer. He said, people misunderstand that concept. It doesn't mean we're chosen and no one else is chosen. It means we were chosen for a specific task to bring Torah to the world, and other nations can be chosen for other things. Great answer. And the Dalai Lama chuckled and said, that's great. I ask you because, we Tibetans, we think we're a chosen people too. So it was a very sort of funny and wonderful moment. But why do I bring up the Dalai Lama? I bring up the Dalai Lama because he has been, and the reason I know him is because he has been going around the country, or for the last, or at least before COVID, he's now too old to travel, trying to promote his book Beyond Religion that you see on the left. And what that book says is all major religions and even non-religious philosophical systems, most of them, not all of them, many of them, believe in the importance of compassion. Most religions think of compassion as an absolutely fundamental trait that human beings should have. So he argues, why don't we start there? Let's create what he calls a secular ethic. And by secular, the word secular in India, where he lives, is different in English there than it is here. Here it means non-religious. But in India, the word secular means everybody, religious and non-religious. So secular includes everybody. He says, let's create a secular ethic that is an ethic that everybody, religious and non-religious, as well as all the different religions, can start with compassion, and then build from there. But the second half of his book is about what he calls discernment. Once we start with compassion, then we need to use our rational minds to figure out particular problems. So this is in the spirit of Aristotle, the idea we start by cultivating a moral virtue of compassion, and we get not a naive one, not a knee-jerk one, but a sophisticated, well-informed, well-developed sense of compassion. And then we bring rationality in to make specific decisions. So now let's turn to some Jewish insights. There we've got two Jewish boys from a fictional TV series. Some of you might have seen at some point in your life. And that whole series was about comparing the rational thought of Mr. Spock to the emotional decision-making of Captain Kirk. That was actually what the whole series was about. So Star Trek encapsulates this exact question. But since it starred two Jewish fellows, I thought I'd throw the picture up there for you. So what are some Jewish insights into this whole argument? Here is a story from Talmud. An elderly woman went to Rabbi Yosef ben Halafta and said that she was so old that her life had no more meaning and that she had lost her desire to live and wanted to leave the world. The rabbi asked how she had managed to live to such a ripe old age, and she replied that she prayed in her synagogue every morning. Absent yourself from the synagogue for 3 consecutive days, the rabbi suggested. The woman followed his advice, and on the 3rd day, she died. Now think about that for a second. First of all, it's a powerful little story. But is this a rational ethic story? Or is this a story about wisdom, emotional intelligence, trying to bring a sense of emotional sophistication to a difficult situation? So the question we ask ourselves is, what does Judaism itself say about this rational, ethical conundrum? So what did Hillel say when he was asked what the fundamental Jewish principle was? What is hateful to you, do not do unto your neighbor. That is, to Hillel, the fundamental ethic of Judaism. Is that a rational or an emotional statement? Well, it's about hate. It's about what you don't like. It's about an emotional perspective. So Hillel is arguing that there's a fundamental emotional component to the most fundamental Torah. Emotions are common in the Torah. God is said often to act out of compassion, anger, even jealousy. Our God is a jealous God, says our tradition, right? So we attribute emotional states to God. On the other hand, we're commanded to actually embody certain emotional traits. We're commanded to love God. We're commanded to love the ger, the convert, the stranger in our midst. We're commanded to love our neighbors. Biblical figures are often shown in emotional situations. And emotions are clearly part of halakha as well. There's a lot of halachic writings about embarrassing people, shaming them, about the nature of dignity. We can violate the Shabbat. You can't violate the Shabbat for many things, very few. But one of the things you actually can violate the Shabbat for is to preserve someone's dignity. That's an emotional state, not a rational state, dignity. And Avodah Zarah says a person can only study that which his heart desires. So passion, desire is also part of the way in which we think about Torah study itself, which is usually portrayed as a rational activity, not an emotional activity. And I say all of this to say that you will often see and you can often read about the fact that the Jewish perspective is a rational one. And I want to show you there's a deep emotional connection there too. But we also understand that emotions can mislead. The reason we wear tzitzit, for those of you who daven, you know, in the 3rd paragraph of the Shema, it says that you should, when you look upon the tzitzit, you will remember to observe the commandments and not follow your heart and eyes, which will lead you astray, which will lead you, says our rabbis, to lustful thoughts. And lust doesn't just mean sex there, it means desire for food or whatever it is. The tzitzit are there to remind us to temper our emotionality. The Talmud tells us that the destruction of the temple itself, the greatest tragedy in our history, was due to sinat chinam, baseless hatred. So this wrong emotional state led to the destruction of the temple. On the other hand, it's also true that pure rationality is frowned upon. One of the great rabbis, Elisha ben Abuya, became a heretic. They call him Acher, the other, because he left Judaism and became an apostate. But here's the thing. The tradition tells us that he was the best rational arguer of any rabbi of his time. Even his student, Rameir, who was supposed to be the most brilliant arguer of the time, was constantly out-argued by Elisha ben Abuya. Well, why would we say that the most rational, the best rational mind of his generation was the guy who left Judaism? It's because pure rationality was also seen as being able to lead us astray if we don't bring our heart into the study of Torah. So Judaism is balanced in this way. And it says something like, if you do the mitzvot, if you engage in right behavior and rational thinking, you will develop the correct emotional perspective towards it. It's the virtue ethic. It's an Aristotelian and Dalai Lama-ish argument that through virtue and through making the right kinds of decisions, you will cultivate an ethical way of living. Do what you ought to, and soon you will do what you want to. And I will end with a quote from Rav Kook. Rav Kook, the chief rabbi of Israel, one of the great minds of modern Israel, says, "Man cannot live with intellect alone, nor with emotion alone. Intellect and emotion must forever be joined together. If he wishes to burst beyond his own level, that is to exceed oneself and one's limitations, he will lose his ability to feel, and his flaws and deficiencies will be myriad despite the strength of his intellect." So if you're Elisha ben Abuya and you try to just be intellectual, you're going to be in trouble. And needless to say, if he sinks into unmitigated emotion, he will fall to the depths of foolishness, which leads to all weakness and sin. Only the quality of equilibrium, which balances intellect with emotion, can deliver him completely. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Paul. That was wonderful. Quite a lot of chatting. Not so many questions as philosophical discourse among the participants, but we do have some questions. We have it's 5 of 8. With the indulgence of the whole group, why don't we stay a little longer than our end time?
Mm-hmm.
Question: where does belief fall under this? Is belief more under emotion and not cognition? How do we? Where does the belief system fall into ethical decision making?
Well, that's a great question, and I think the important thing about belief is that it needs to be flexible. You know, one of the differences between Judaism and Christianity is based on belief. Believe and you shall be saved. The goal of Christianity is to believe something. That's never been the goal of Judaism. In fact, there's a story in the Talmud where God says, "Would that they not believe in me and do my mitzvot." In other words, God says, given a choice between believing in me and being evil and not believing in me and doing the commandments, I'd prefer they don't believe in me and that they do the right thing. So the key about belief, Judaism doesn't talk a lot about belief. It's not that interested in belief because its attitude is that belief changes as you get more educated. Now, it very strongly believes in God and in God's Torah, but once that fundamental belief is accepted, proximate beliefs, I mean, the Talmud is an arguing document. It's trying to convince people to change their beliefs or to accept. This rabbi is trying to get other rabbis to accept what he believes. So the entire Talmud is based on the idea of the pliability and flexibility of belief. And I think that's the Jewish perspective.
Thank you. Are ethics and the 613 mitzvot the same within Judaism?
No, because the 600, I mean, if ethics and the 613 mitzvot were enough, we wouldn't need the Talmud. You know, I always say, you know, if you look at the 10 Commandments and you look at don't murder, I mean, it's often translated as thou shalt not kill, but that's actually not the right translation of that mitzvah, of that commandment. It is thou shalt not murder. The word for killing is a different word. Thou shalt not murder. 2 words in the original Hebrew. You can't get any simpler than that. Don't murder. And yet go to your nearest law library and look up the books that try to explain what that means. There are thousands of them. when is it murder? When is it not murder? What is murder? What isn't murder? So the 613 mitzvot are the starting point. And each one needs to be thought about and debated and discussed and probed. And that's where argument and belief, and I mean, here we are 2,500 years later, and we're still arguing about them. That's what they're for. They're to challenge us. They're to make us think. They're not enough in and of themselves.
We read so much about trying to be close to God. Do we get close to God through our emotions? Can we get close to God through our cognition?
Yeah, I mean, through both. I mean, I just got back from 10 days in Arizona. I was in Sedona, one of the most beautiful desert places in the world, as far as I'm concerned. My wife and I spent the whole time hiking. And there were moments when I was standing in the painted cliffs of Sedona where I felt a sense of the divine. That was an emotional response to my environment that brought me closer to God. And then there are times in debate, in Jewish debate and Jewish thought, maybe through tefillah, through other ways, however people feel a sense of closeness to God, that one can do that through more cognitive means. So I think both.
Can you give an example?
Well, I mean,
a cognitive example?
Well, I think, look, I don't know how many of you have ever studied Talmud, but you sit around in a circle and you read a tractate of Talmud and you argue about it and you debate it and you try to bring in proof texts. And that process is supposed to bring you, Torah is supposed to bring you closer to God. That is through the intellectual intercourse, through this grappling with questions, through the richness of the tradition, one is supposed to get closer to God. So both emotionally and through cognitive means, we're supposed to find roots. And I think it's a personality thing as well. For some people, they need an emotional approach to God and more, and that's really where they're going to find God. And for other people, it's more of a intellectual, rational journey.
Does ethical decision-making require us to quantify things, like quantify happiness or other kind of emotional elements? So is there a quantification involved in the emotional situation?
Only if you're a consequentialist or utilitarian, because a consequentialist or utilitarian says we need to maximize happiness, maximize goodness. Well, if you're talking about maximizing, if you're talking about weighing the good consequences against bad consequences of an action, you need a way to do that. So yes, for some people, that is what you need to do. If you're a virtue ethicist, if you're what we call a deontologist, when someone uses principles, Kant is a deontologist, the 10 Commandments is deontology. You don't need to quantify it. Thou shalt not murder is not a quantity question. It's an ideological question. Cultivating compassion is not a quantity question. It's a character building question. So the question of quantity only comes in with certain systems of ethics and not others.
Do you see any shift in ethical decision-making in this generation of Jewish community as opposed to a prior generation?
So I have a daughter who's a rabbi. I gave the commencement talk at the Ziegler School in LA when she graduated. When she got her smicha, I was the speaker. And what I said to this group was that every generation in some way or another reinvents Judaism. I think of my parents and my grandparents' generation, my grandparents and great-grandparents, they were the generation that came over from Eastern Europe. And then my parents' generation were the institution builders. They built the synagogues and the JCCs and those kinds of things. Then my generation were program builders. We started the Chavurah movement. We started, the Jewish catalog and ways of trying to make Jewish life more compatible with American society. So I asked, what is it that your generation, meaning my daughter's generation, what is it that your generation is going to do? And I answered by saying, I have no idea, but I know that you're going to do something new and exciting. Since then, I've watched her and her cohort, and their version of Judaism is new and exciting. It's very land-based. There's a lot of going out into the natural environment and trying to celebrate Judaism's tied to the land, something that we've forgotten about. We started out as a desert nomadic people. We started out very tied into the land. A lot of our discussion in the Talmud that we have forgotten is very land-based. And now they're trying to recapture that and rethink those kinds of things. So yeah, I think this next generation's Judaism is going to be a very different, have a different kind of focus, still very based in our tradition, but different generations emphasize different parts of the tradition.
Two more questions. First, or the penultimate question, is ethical decision-making shaped by the brain's biology?
I believe it is, yes. I mean, we only have certain capacities. We look at ethics a certain way because we evolved our brains to be that way. We're profoundly and deeply social animals. Of the higher animals, we're about as social as you get. We live in groupings of millions of people, and we are all about communication and social intercourse. I mean, the isolated human being that doesn't interact with other human beings is extremely rare, and it's usually very damaging. So we are about being social, and our brains evolved for a deep, profound way of thinking about each other. So when I teach sort of ethics 101, the first example I give them, and I almost put it into this talk, but it would have taken us too long and too far astray. Think about this quickly for 1 second. You're on a boat, the boat sinks, you're there in the water, and you see a rock sticking out of the water. You swim over to the rock, you climb up onto this giant rock, you're sitting on top. There's no plant life or animal life or insect or anything. It's just a bare rock sticking way out of the water, and you're sitting there waiting for some ship to come and rescue you. Here's the question. Can you do something unethical on that rock? So I ask students this all the time, and they have a very hard time coming up with something unethical you can do. You can hurt yourself. That's one answer. Another answer is you could sort of plot to hurt someone else. Is that itself unethical? We could talk about that. But why? The question is, why is it so hard to think of something unethical to do? It's because I've removed all of your relationships. Ethics is about how we treat others, whether they're other human beings or whether they're animals or whether they're natural environment. It's about how we treat other things. And when I remove all the other things from you, it's very hard to figure out what you can do that's unethical. That's how profoundly social we are and how profoundly ethics is built in to our social brains.
Final question. What's one piece of ethical decision-making advice you can give this group?
Okay, so I've been an ethicist for 40 years, and here is the single most important insight that I have from it. And we all know this, but we don't often realize we know it until we hear someone say it explicitly. If I said to you, forget everything that we've talked about today, but if I just came up to you, or if you were sitting in my class for the first time and I said the following sentence, ethics is about deciding between what is blank and blank, everybody would know the answer to that. And the answer is between what is right and wrong. We're taught that from the time we're infants. And I want to argue that that is not what ethics is. Ethics is not, or better put, not usually, about deciding between right and wrong. When we really get down to right and wrong, it's a pretty easy decision. You're hungry, you go into the nearest store, there's a candy bar there, picking it up and putting it in your pocket and walking out is wrong. And we don't need to bring a bunch of ethicists in to discuss whether that's right or wrong. We know it's wrong. We may do it, but we know it's wrong. Ethical dilemmas for adults are almost never between right and wrong. They are almost always between two rights in conflict. What do I mean by that? I teach medical students. We give them vignettes all the time. So here's an example. You have a patient and that patient wants you to do X, but you think X is bad for them, and you think they should do Y. What's the problem? Why is that an ethical dilemma? You have two values in conflict: patient autonomy, a patient's right to decide what to do with their own body, and beneficence, your responsibility to do what's in the best interest of the patient. The problem isn't a right and a wrong. The problem is you have two positive right values in conflict, and you can't satisfy both of them. And if you think about almost any ethical dilemma you've had in your life, serious ethical dilemma, you will see that it's not about a right versus a wrong. It is about two values you care about, both of which can't be satisfied. So you have to sacrifice one positive value for another one, and which one, and sometimes two or three or four can be in conflict. So I think one of the great ethical insights that we need to remember is that ethics is not about right versus wrong in most cases. It's about how you balance competing values, competing rights. And when we remember that, not only do we make better ethical decisions, but we understand that if we had an ethical dilemma and I said, weighing all these values, I think we should do A, and Noah said, weighing all of these values, I think we should do B, that doesn't mean I'm right, Noah's wrong, or Noah's right and I'm wrong. It means that in our calculus of values, we're weighing values differently, and both of those decisions can be ethically defensible. And that also explains why we have different systems of ethics in different times and different places. A question I'm asked is something like, do I believe there's one ethic for all time, or do I believe ethics changes over time and place? And my answer is yes. Both of those are true. That is, freedom, duty, responsibility, honesty, love, you name the ethical value, they've always been true for all human beings in all times and all places. There aren't new ethical values. But so why is ethics so different in time and place and cultures? It's because when you have those values competing with each other, different times and different places weigh values differently. Quick example, in the West, we weight individual liberty over community responsibility. And when those two things come in conflict, we often decide in favor of individual liberty. While in Asia, they weigh community responsibility more heavily than individual responsibility. So you give the exact same scenario to someone from the West and someone from China, and you will get two different answers. But that's not because they have a different sense of right and wrong. It's because they weigh these two values differently in their cultures.
Thank you, Paul. We are
My
in a
pleasure.
conflict with two values. One value is we want you to keep talking forever and ever. The other one is we're really protective of your time. So, but we want to thank you. But I will say to everyone on this Zoom, use today as an opportunity to continue the conversation in your respective synagogues. After Shabbos, whether you're in person, whether you're on Zoom, that's really what we're hoping to do with the entire series, is to use this as an opportunity to continue the conversations and expand your Jewish experiences beyond the Zoom screen of today. So I wish you all a happy, a healthy, a very safe holiday season, a happy and a healthy new year. And Paul, again, thank you so much. Thank you, Rebecca, for everything that you've done. Thank you for our committee for putting this whole thing together. And we'll see you on Tu B'Shvat to talk about Jewish ethics and the environment. Have a nice evening, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you, Paul.